Hi, I'm Malorie Blackman, author of the Noughts and Crosses sequence, and I'm going to be talking about my new book, Double Cross. Now, Double Cross is about a boy called Toby Durbridge. He was a minor character in my last book in the sequence, Checkmate, and now this story is all his. And basically it's about him trying not to get caught up in gang culture and the criminal underworld, and unfortunately for him it doesn't quite work that way, and he gets up to his armpits and beyond in sort of all this stuff going on, and his girlfriend Callie Rose gets very badly injured, and so he goes and tries to get revenge on the ones who kind of did it. So it's a sort of thriller, and I wanted to explore the whole thing about gang culture and what makes people join gangs and how hard it is to avoid those when that's kind of what all your friends are into and so on. And to be honest, I was going to only write 3 books. It was going to, Noughts and Crosses was going to be 3 books, but then Toby started whispering in my ear and he wouldn't leave me alone, and so it became a sort of 4-book sequence. So as far as am I going to write any more, I don't know, but we'll see if somebody else whispers in my ear, another character whispers in my ear. I actually finished Double Cross in January of 2008, but the inspiration for it, over the last couple of years, I've been watching how gang culture seems to be more prevalent, and this idea of not really belonging unless you belong to some gang, and the proliferation of the use of knives has been particularly worrying. So I wanted to kind of include that as a theme in the book, and it's just kind of exploded this year since my book's been finished. But I really did want to address that issue and the whole thing about why people join gangs, and it is that sense of, seems to me to be a sense of wanting to belong somewhere, and that's how Toby feels in the book, where he's really on the outside because he won't join any of these gangs until his girlfriend gets shot, and then suddenly he finds himself in this world, immersed in this world, and it's kind of very easy to get caught up in it. So that's why I wanted to write the book. Now this is Toby's chapter, and this is when they're in the wasteland, which is what they call their kind of local park, and they're watching a football game when it all kind of kicks off, and 2 groups start firing guns at each other, and Callie Rose and Toby and all their friends are kind of in the middle. God's sake, Callie, get down! I hit the floor trying to pull Callie with me, but she stood stock still in front of me, staring across the park. I scrambled in front of her, pulling harder at her arm. Furious, I looked up at her, wondering why the hell she wasn't moving. God's sake! Bullets were now whizzing around us like mosquitoes around a blood bank. God's sake! Callie looked down at me. And that's when my world crashed to an abrupt halt. A dark crimson stain was spreading out over the front of Callie's sky blue shirt. More gunshots. Something glanced off the side of Callie's head and she toppled, her body falling like a house of playing cards. Callie! I threw my body over hers, trying to protect her from stray bullets. Macaulay's car screeched down the road, burning rubber as it went. The 2 crossmen who'd made a great show of strolling across the grass towards us were now racing back to their own car. Moments later, they too screeched out of sight. Everyone ran for their lives. Dan, who'd dived down beside me at the sound of the first bullet being fired, picked himself up and bolted. Within moments, there was no one left in the wasteland except me and Callie. I sat up, pulling Callie with me, the crimson stain growing bigger, covering more of Callie's shirt. There was a circular hole on the left-hand side of her shirt, just below her shoulder. Blood ran down from the side of her head, from her temple, past her ears. "Help us! Someone help us!" I yelled out. Callie's eyes were closed, and her breath left her nose and mouth in a strange rattling sound. I looked around at all the closed windows of the flats and houses that surrounded the wasteland on 3 sides. "Please, someone help!" I pulled Callie to me, rocking her back and forth in my arms as we both sat on the ground. Digging into my trouser pocket, I brought out my phone with one hand, laying it on the ground so I could dial the emergency services for an ambulance without letting go of Callie. "Callie, hang on," I whispered in her ear. "Help will be here soon, just hang on." The clouds separated and sunlight bathed us, so bright I was momentarily blinded. The rattling sound Callie was making suddenly stopped. No, she lay limp in my arms, and her sudden silence was far, far worse. In the distance I could hear the sound of a siren. Someone, somewhere must have phoned for help after all. "Callie," I whispered. She lay so still, like a broken doll. My hands and clothes were covered with her blood. I hugged her to me, her cheek against mine, rocking her gently back and forth. I've got you, Callie, I've got you. I'll never let you go, never. You and me, babe, against the world. I've been writing now for 18 years, and before that I was a computer programmer, and it's one of those things that I never thought I could be a published writer, even though I've been writing stories and poems for myself from the time I was like 6 or 7, just for my own amusement. But it was only when I was in my mid-20s I thought, oh, shall I see if I can get some published? So many rejection letters later, I finally had my first book published, and here I am 18 years later with Double Cross, my latest book. And Double Cross is my 56th book, something like that, 56, 57. So I'm kind of really glad when I was getting all those rejection letters that I didn't give up. The extract I'm going to read now is where Dan, who's Toby's best friend, has taken him to meet the criminal kind of boss, who's called Macaulay. And Macaulay asked Toby if he wanted to work, if Toby wanted to work for him, and Toby turned him down flat. And now Toby's going to go and try and get a job because he needs the money. At least this is what he's going to try and convince Macaulay of. Toby, do something for me, said Macaulay silkily. Point that gun at Dan and shoot him. I must have misheard. Pardon? You heard me, said Macaulay. He picked up his cup of mint tea and started sipping it. The gun sat awkwardly in my hand as I looked from Dan back to Macaulay. You want me to kill your friend? Macaulay's voice was soft and slick as melted butter. Dan stared at Macaulay, horror-stricken. He struggled against Byron's python grip in earnest now, but there was no way Byron was letting him go. Well, Toby, said Macaulay. Mr. Macaulay, please, Dan pleaded. I work for you. I'm a good worker. You brought a stranger to my house unannounced and uninvited, Macaulay turned to snap at him. Into my house. You never, ever bring anyone here without my permission, Dan. For that alone you need sorting. I'm sorry, Mr. Macaulay, I messed up, Dan cried out. Toby's my friend, and you offered him a job. I didn't think it would do any harm. You didn't think, full stop. You're a fool, Dan, and that makes you a liability, Macaulay replied. Toby, either shoot him or give me the gun so I can take care of business. Would I be included in his business? Probably. I looked at Dan, who was shaking his head frantically at me. The gun in my hand was so heavy. My dad had taught me all about guns before he left. He used to buy all kinds of gun magazines, and he'd sit me on his lap and we'd looked at the photographs and read the specifications together before he took off. But Dad would never have dreamt of having a gun in our house or anywhere near it, not a real one. He had a couple of replicas, but he said it was to study the engineering behind them. The last time he disappeared, Mum put the replicas in the bin. That's when I knew he wasn't coming back. And now I had a real gun in my hand, loaded with real bullets. Slowly, I raised my hand, pointing the gun straight at Dan's head. Toby, no, I'm begging you, don't, please. Dan fought like a wild thing to get out of Byron's grasp, but it was futile. Though his lips were a thin, immovable slash across his face, I could tell Byron was enjoying himself by the gleam in his green eyes. Toby, no! Tears streamed down Dan's face. A dark stain began to spread across the crotch of his light blue jeans. Sorry, Dan. I lowered my gaze, trying to get it together. My arm fell to my side. The gun was heavy, so very heavy. Stretch out my arm. Hold the gun steady. If I'm wrong, if I've got this wrong. Take aim, Toby. I raised my arm to aim the gun directly at Dan's heart. Toby, no! Dan screamed out. Legs slightly apart, body braced. I concentrated on just one face, and I pulled the trigger.